Hello boys and girls, welcome to this diary edition of The Great Everything, an exploration of our world through culture and philosophy. I'm Patrick, a former banking lawyer who saw the light and quit to dedicate my life to art, donuts and transformation, and make of that what you will. It's the 25th of April and I want to talk about education. Should we rethink our approach to education? So, the way our school system is currently set up is based on a very specific conception of the job market, and also the kinds of skills that we'll need in order better to perform within that market. I'm talking, of course, about the industrial system, which is a system steeped in the ideas of capitalism and free markets, and that Henry Ford-style economy of scale, which itself is an idea based on notions of specialization and efficiency. The idea that if everyone gets really, really good and really, really fast at doing just one thing, just one part of the greater task, then together we'll be able to produce far more and reach those economies of scale. If you want to know my thoughts on that, perhaps check out my episode on Leonardo, who was the opposite of that way of looking at the world. He was someone who didn't just specialize in one thing, but was, as I called him, a master of all trades, somehow moving beyond that paradigm that you can either be a jack of all trades or a master of one. Anyway, that's neither here nor there for this conversation, because now I'm talking about education and the effect that it has on our education system, that we are living in a world that is based on these industrial notions of specialization and efficiency. What it means is that our schools basically teach us to be like perfect little cogs in a larger machine, to perform these repetitive tasks, sort of resemble the kinds of repetitive tasks we'll also be performing as accountants or secretaries or factory workers or burger flippers, or in my case, corporate lawyers. And then we're also taught at school to memorize facts and then acritically just regurgitate those facts at periodic intervals, tests, papers, midterms, exams. And none of this is done in an effort to gain knowledge or understanding or, dare I say it, even wisdom about the world. The whole point is just to tick certain bureaucratic boxes that allow us to be ranked. Similarly to how performance reviews at the workplace will also rank us and other employees, so that they can determine our efficiency and our financial value to the company. School also values collection of narrow facts over broad understanding of the living world and all its complex dynamics. And in all this, curiosity and creativity and the notion of just questioning what we're told, all these are just left ignored. And the result, of course, is generations of acritical cogs and unquestioning consumers who just sort of seamlessly fit into the capitalist industrial system and do as they're told. Do as they're told by the system itself, by advertising and other similar big brothers that we have watching over us. This stifling of our critical thinking is a problem in of itself. But the problem is made even more urgent by the challenges that we're facing at our time and that we will continue to face in the coming decades. It's nothing new that innovations in technology and sciences and our culture generally, all these new things have created a job market that looks very, very different from the job market our parents operated in. Globalization has broadened competition, so you're no longer competing against your neighbor, you're competing against someone from from the other side of the world who doesn't even have to come to your country to compete with you. He can stay where he is and totally outcompete you. Then you have advances in artificial intelligence, which mean that there's millions of jobs out there that are just no longer in need of humans to do them. And at the same time, the internet has created whole new industries, whole new career types. Yet, there's nothing about our current school system that seems to be preparing us for all this, that's preparing us for the changed and changing environment. There's nothing that's enabling us to outcompete the workforce from former third world countries. There's nothing that's preparing us for creative tech work. There's nothing that's giving us the skills to start an online business, nothing. And that's not the only kind of challenges we're facing. The changes in our social and political landscape, with these big questions about democracy, does it even work? And what's fact versus just fake news? And the whole idea of polarization in the world. How the hell do we even get along anymore? We're not being given the kind of cognitive tools that can enable us to find solutions to these problems, to make sense of this confusion, and effectively cooperate together to find these better solutions. So what do we do about it? Education really is the big fix here. Education is what equips us with those tools, with the basics, the framework. And then we can independently develop that framework in whatever direction we find most useful for us to achieve our goals. But if our education system is founded on an old-fashioned and out-of-date conception of what even is useful, then a change is needed. But what would this change look like? What are the kinds of notions and concepts and skills that we need to educate our children with so that they're better equipped to successfully navigate today's world and tomorrow's? On this topic, I read an interesting article on Medium by the philosopher Maarten van Doorn about how studying history is more important than ever in today's economy. Now, if you've listened to The Great Everything before, you probably know that history is one of the things I insist everyone needs to be familiar with, just in order to make sense of our world. You know, we all come from somewhere, and without knowing our own origin story, the mistakes we made and what we got right in getting here, without knowing all that, how can we know the best practices to put in place to build a better future? How could we even know what that future should look like? So I got in touch with the author of the article, and I asked him to talk to me and discuss his ideas, what's wrong with education, and what we can do to fix it. So next up, philosopher Maarten van Doorn on the importance of history in our education. Maarten, thank you so much for joining me on this call. I've been reading your articles on Medium, and I've been really enjoying them. Generally, I like the approach, I like the attitude, I like the kind of ideas you're discussing, and I like the fact that you discuss them in a way that is accessible, and it's clear that the purpose is for them to be accessible. So, for the benefit of my listeners, could you just introduce yourself and what you do, what your focus is?
Of course. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to hear that you've been enjoying my articles. So I'm a PhD student in philosophy at Central European University in Budapest, where I do my PhD mainly in meta-ethics, but more importantly, I run a blog on Medium focused on practical philosophy.
How would you define meta-ethics for non-philosophers?
Right. So meta-ethics is the discipline that asks, when you make an ethical statement such as, for example, murder is wrong, what is it that we're actually doing? So it seems like we're saying this act of murder has this property of wrongness, and what is that for kind of property? How do we find out about that property? Is it a property that exists, etc., etc.?
It's the differentiation, I suppose, between normative ethics, which is the asking questions and trying to find answers to the question of what it is we should actually do, to instead shifting the focus on what the nature of right or wrong, good or bad is, in simple terms.
Exactly. Yes. That's very well put.
The second thing you just raised, practical philosophy. Now, that's the kind of thing that gets my ears raised. It's, I think, the most important aspect of philosophy. Philosophy in general, especially to the lay people, sometimes gets met with a sneer as a word. The idea of philosophers are just people who sit around talking about irrelevant stuff, going into the meanings of words to a level of detail that bears no connection or relevance to ordinary day-to-day life of your average human being. So practical philosophy, what is that, and what does that mean to you?
All right, those are very interesting observations. So the first thing I'd like to say is that it's completely right that the normal people have kind of developed this disdain for this philosophy thing that has been going on, because, well, philosophers have kind of forgot about these aspects of philosophy. Like in the ancient time, that used to be the main purpose of philosophy, to be, as the ancients would say, something like therapy for the soul. But on the other hand, I think it's a bit of a mistake to say that all this analytic academic philosophy that's going on these days is kind of obsolete or something because it's not directly applicable in practical life. Although I do believe that the thinking skills that you learn and some of the theories that you get acquainted with are very useful tools for improving your life, basically. So that's what I try to do in my blog.
Yes, it does give you practical skills, but even I was just thinking, saying that, the idea that the layperson has a condescending attitude towards philosophy because it can't be applied practically, or the analytic side of philosophy tends to not be directly applicable. Yet somehow you never hear people raise the same kind of objection to things like quantum mechanics, right? Nobody ever says that, why would I need to know anything about quantum mechanics because it's not applicable to how much I have to pay for my bus ticket. Yet at the same time, quantum mechanics leads to a series of scientific discoveries that result in us being able to fit a computer into our pocket. And I would say that you could say something similar for a lot of analytic philosophy, that if you look at what the actual philosophers are saying, it might seem like there's no relevance to practical life, but the consequences, the implications of what is being discussed may be very, very practical. But really, what I wanted to talk to you about is education. You wrote a really interesting article on Medium, which we'll link to in the show notes. And the title is "Studying History is More Important Than Ever in Today's Economy." I think that there's a lot of talk happening right now. There's a lot of noise on how the job market is shifting due to mainly innovations in technology and artificial intelligence, and the idea that we are moving towards a world where the job market may be radically different from what we can even imagine now. I don't know if you've heard Yuval Harari talk about the rise of the useless class, people whose skills simply mean that they will be unable to find any type of job in the next 30 years, and there being a real question as to how we should retrain them and how they should be spending their spare time. The main crux of the issue, as far as I'm concerned, is education. So I just wanted to ask you, with that long preamble, could you give us the gist of what your argument is for a rethinking of our education system?
Sure. So the current educational system was designed to meet the needs of an industrializing society. So what we're doing now is training children to be a well-functioning cog in this big machine that is society. So basically what we learn them to do is follow these set of instructions. And it used to be that was a useful, let's say, skill to have, or perhaps even attitude to have, because what you were supposed to do after school until your retirement was kind of do a job along these kind of lines. But being obedient is not anymore the thing that we need our people to do, because in the globalizing economy that we have these days, so no longer the industrializing economy, there are plenty of people in the world that are willing to be obedient for much less money than we are, and probably arguably are even better at it, culturally speaking and everything. So we're teaching our children the wrong set of skills. So this model doesn't work anymore. And if we can't out-obedience the competition, we should out-lead and out-solve them. And I take this from Seth Godin, who has written a lot about it. He said, so there's two skills that we should teach our children. One, how to solve interesting problems, and two, how to lead. And then I make, in my blog, I take this and I make the case that if you study history in a certain way, that can give you insights into these skills that you do not get from studying any other discipline.
You're saying that our current school system is educating us, is training us to be cogs in a larger machine and for obedience. Do you have anything specific in mind when you say that? What are these habits that are being inculcated? What are the skills that we're being taught right now that are, so to speak, leading us astray?
So the things I have in mind are things like we organize our classrooms in rows of 4 tables horizontally and 4 tables to the back, and everyone is just sitting in rows and taking standardized tests, reading stuff, learning about stuff just to check the boxes to pass the test. It's really like you would have to meet this kind of criterion, which are the same for everyone, right? So you really being brought up to do this, and there's this fixed curriculum, and the teacher tells you what to do, and you read it, and then you make the test, and you're done.
And there's something quite repetitive about the process as well, about how we go through the motions of the education system, in particular at school and high school, that seems almost like it's designed to prepare us for the repetitive jobs that we will have in our current forms of industry. You could say that ever since Adam Smith, we've been living in this age of hyper-specialization. It's a bit like we're all factory workers to a certain extent. We're all just doing one thing over and over and over again. We're getting really good and very efficient at doing that one thing, but we don't see how it fits into a bigger picture. You know, as a finance lawyer, which is what I used to do, to some extent, much of what I was doing was just redrafting the same thing to an ever-increasing level of detail, but it was incredibly repetitive. And there's something about our school system that inculcates that into you. And also working to deadlines, it seems like that's too designed to the kind of challenges that you'll have to face in a big company. That's one thing. And how do you think history can teach us to do what Seth Godin says we should do, i.e. learn to solve problems and learn to lead?
Yeah, I can see why you'd ask that question. Mm-hmm. And the idea here I take from the Chinese philosopher Mengzi, and he says, look, basically, if you study history in a certain way, you study it for self-improvement. So you study history to understand why certain behavior or certain acts in a given social cultural context had the consequences that they did. So if you really, really try to understand that, so not just memorize these dates, but really understand why that happened as it happened, that's going to make you better at solving complex problems.
That's something quite interesting as a conception of history, and it seems to be recurring, in particular with ancient thinkers. I don't know how familiar you are with ancient history, which is what I studied at university, at undergrad. It's a recurrent theme, this idea of history as a provider of moral teachings, especially with biographies. So there's these ancient authors like Plutarch who would write the lives of the great men, and the intention is explicitly to find teachings about how these people lived that we should apply to our own. So history seen as self-help. While that is certainly the case with biographies, the parallel with actual living human beings is obvious. But how would you place an understanding of historical trends in being able to improve our own lives? Where would you find the self-development angle in understanding the development of the Renaissance, for instance, as a trend rather than as a collection of famous individuals?
Interesting question. I'm inclined to think that the self-development angle is definitely less prevalent in these kind of questions, although I suppose there could be some. So, for example, the other day I was listening to Ray Dalio's new book, Principles, and by studying all of the other economic crises, like from the 1930s and whatnot, he managed to, or that's the reason why he saw the economic crisis of 2008 coming and predicted it in such a way that all their stocks and everything went up because they were like big time, while all the other competing companies lost because they didn't see it coming. If you manage to recognize these historical patterns,
yes,
that definitely can pay off. But it's a different yeah, you're right to point out the difference.
But I do still agree that there is a self-improvement angle. It might not be as immediately clear, but being able to recognize historical patterns is important for being able to determine to some extent where we might be within the pattern. The problem with that, of course, is that we talk about historical patterns, but patterns are something that we create and we project on top of history, which is really just a series of events. So really recognizing historical patterns means little more than creating a pattern or just choosing a pattern that you particularly are interested in or that you find helpful. So in terms of predictive power, it really is quite difficult to ever establish. But sorry, without wanting to go too much into the weeds on that, you talk about history, but are there any other skills, any other topics, any other ways of thinking that should be taught at a very early level in our schools to equip us for the world of the coming decades?
two things come to mind. The first one is the skill of reasonable doubt, right? So I think it's very important that you get taught not just to learn something and answer questions about it, but see the bigger picture and have this critical thinking skill. Just don't assume what people teach you, but critically evaluate it by your own lights and point out the mistakes that you think are there. And don't take it for granted. Don't accept the authority arguments. Really, we should train people more to spot the flaws in certain people's arguments. The thing that came to mind here is that, for example, if people would have been more trained in that, we might have had a different president in the United States, for example.
Yes, I mean, I wonder the extent to which it's true that fake news influenced that election, but it is certainly true that if we were better at distinguishing facts from narratives and questioning things critically in a way that doesn't assume that what we are fed by any authority, whether in the media or institutional, instead of just assuming that those are true, certainly I think that we would be in a very different place than we've come to be in the past few years. So critical thinking, reasonable doubt, and understanding the bigger picture, how things hang together. Do you think there would be value in teaching mindfulness in general? I'm not talking about meditation mindfulness, but just an awareness of our own patterns of thinking and basic training in cognitive biases. Would that be part of your education package as well?
Yeah, totally. That would be hugely beneficial, I think, to learn to see that your perspective is a perspective.
You sort of touched on this, but what role, if any, does philosophy have in this education system that you envisage?
Well, this critical thinking skill is kind of the core business of philosophy. So definitely it's going to have a role there.
I had one more question for you. In the realm of practical philosophy and the kind of just thinking toolkits that you think that we should all have or at least develop, who are your inspirations in today's landscape?
So I really like reading Alain de Botton.
Yep.
Who is a philosopher really doing this practical thing, thinking about real life issues.
His book on Proust is phenomenal, I think. How Proust can change your life.
And it's a super enjoyable read. I'd recommend everyone to read it. It's not that thick. It's quite funny, well written.
Anyone else spring to mind?
I really like Malcolm Gladwell's work, although that's not really argumentative in the way that we were talking about. But that's who I really like to read, because the way he puts things together is, I think, very inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Maarten, before you go, where can people find you?
The best place to find me is on my Medium blog, which is medium.com/Maarten van Doorn, which is very long.
There'll be a link in the show notes, don't worry.
Awesome. So go there, follow me in Medium, and you'll be updated with all my new posts.
Yeah, and I also recommend people sign up to your newsletter, which I signed up to. Let's Think Together. Thank you very much for your time. Best of luck with your day and your studies at CEU, and hopefully we shall meet again in real life.
Hopefully, yes.
Okay, take care. Have a good day, Maarten. Thanks.
Okay, you too. Bye.
Bye.
So what should we know? What are the fundamental things that every human should know and be familiar with in order for each of us to be better equipped to face life's big challenges? So a couple of weeks ago I reached out and asked this question, and I got some pretty interesting answers, mainly on the Facebook group. Anyway, what I'll do now is I'll read you some of my favorite answers to this question, and then I'll share my own thoughts later. Mark came right in saying that critical thinking is the most important thing we should teach at school. So it's about assumptions versus facts, understanding the filters through which we view the world. And I personally couldn't agree more. I think that is actually the top priority as far as I'm concerned, and I'll expand on this in a bit. Brian, my friend Brian, he came in with a series of subjects, which are, the classic subjects that we still teach at school today, but giving a few thoughts on why each of these matter. So maths, everyone needs a basic education in mathematics. As Galileo once said, mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe. which is a beautiful and esoteric thought, but on a more practical level, maths is an indispensable tool in the solving of any quantitative problem, from counting your chickens to leaving a tip. Science, of course, we are living in an increasingly scientific age, so a basic scientific literacy is a fundamental tool for navigating our world. I'll expand on that briefly as well. We've already talked about the importance of history, understanding where we come from. Brian adds a little caveat here, and he says this should include historical theory, such as historiography, to understand how people write history and how they interpret it. We view the world through history. How that history is written, therefore, influences the way we view the world. It's very important to understand that. Anyway, Brian continues, language. And of course, language is fundamental, not just in terms of understanding different languages in an increasingly globalized world, but also understanding how language works, because language is another tool through which we interpret the world. And that's something that is becoming a bit of a common theme in these answers. It's not so much what you're learning, but it's also learning about how we learn and how we interpret the world. Language isn't just a collection of words that we put together to ask a waiter for an extra glass of water. No, it's also a tool through which we see and interpret the world. Philosophy is another one on Brian's list. And this is more, he says, about learning how to think and less about what to think. Everyone needs to understand how to ask questions critically and also how to be critical of the answers to those questions. Yes, fundamental. Earl came in with his view, and he just had a little list here. He said, history, important so we don't repeat mistakes. Language, and Earl says, to know what your neighbors say when they think you're ignorant. I love this. Economics, know when you may be getting cheated. Earl seems to be very suspicious of his neighbors. Yeah, he's very worried about what's happening around him. And then first aid, a very practical suggestion there. I like that. No one else suggested first aid, but yeah, I can totally see it. I wouldn't have thought of that myself. Brett comes in from slightly left field, and I loved his answer. He said that beyond school education, we should educate our children to be kind humans and to believe in themselves and think for themselves, to be a leader and not a follower. So first of all, ethics. Yes, we really don't talk enough about teaching kids ethics. Now, problem here, we don't want to be teaching them a specific normative ethic to follow. We don't want to be giving them ethical rules to follow, because how do you choose between all the various different systems of ethics with different rules and different guidelines? How do you know whether to teach them Christian ethics or Aristotelian ethics or consequentialist or utilitarian ethics or deontological ethics like Kant? You can't choose. So instead what you should do is give them a grounding in the different ethical system and let them choose which one works for them, as long as they understand that the idea of being a good and kind person is one of the most important things in our lives. I like that he said, Brett did, to be a leader and not a follower, because Tameju then came in saying this as someone who is in no way a leader, I'd suggest learning how to be an educated follower. Wow, an educated follower, what an idea. So not to follow blindly. There's no way we can all be leaders, Tameju says, and I don't think being a follower is any less important than leading. It's just been spun so that if you're not a leader, you're a sheep. So what Tameju stands for is for learning leadership skills, but since that's not a path everyone can take, learning to be led should also be part of that lesson. I think it's a very interesting thought that seems to make a lot of sense, and I need to probably ponder more deeply. Anyway, these were just some of the answers that I got on Facebook that I wanted to share with you. Going to my own thoughts, I'd like to try and put some order here. From these answers, I think we can broadly divide the kind of things that we need to be educated in into two categories. Learning what we need to learn, so these are the subjects, facts and narratives that we need to understand, and then learning about how we learn. And this category means understanding the mechanisms, voluntary and involuntary, that influence how we and other people process and interpret the world. So that on the one hand, we're not left helplessly at the mercy of our own biases, our prejudices, and all our blind spots. But on the other hand, so that we also have a better understanding and therefore tolerance and even compassion for other people's biases and prejudices and how these influence them, so that when we're talking to someone who has a very different worldview from our own, we don't just see them as an enemy, but as someone who, in our own position, might have felt very differently from how they currently feel. Anyway, let's start with that latter category, this upgrading of our cognitive toolkit. Here's just a few things that I think we really need to know and that matter. 1. Understanding narratives and how they work. This is maybe the most fundamental thing we should all understand, learning to recognize the difference between facts and the stories we impose on the facts. The classic example I always give is asking a girl out for coffee and she says no thanks, and you then feel shit because you've been rejected. Except look closer and you realize that the difference between what happened and your story about what happened is actually quite relevant. Because what happened here? She rejected me. No, that's a story. What happened? She didn't want to come for coffee. No, she never said anything about what she wanted or didn't want. That's a story. So what happened? Okay, I asked her out for coffee and she said no. Exactly, that is what happened. Those are the facts. And there's a billion different reasons she could have said no. Maybe she was in a hurry, she wasn't feeling well, or maybe she actually doesn't like you. But the point is, you just picked a story based on one fact and you ran with it. We keep forgetting that we do this. We keep forgetting this difference between story and fact. And this leads to the story becoming the filter through which we view the world. The story, she rejected me, becomes the story I keep applying to everything. And so before long, that becomes the story, I'm always rejected. And that just builds and builds and builds into a whole worldview that influences how you act in the world and what happens to you in many ways. Anyway, if you want to dig further into this concept, check out my article on thegreateverything.com, Your Story versus What Happened, Manage Your Inner Troll. Moving on, 2, the other thing we need to understand is awareness of bias. Understanding how our background, our upbringing, and our experiences affect how we view the world, to the point that it doesn't just color what we see, but it actually changes what we see. Like, we are blind to certain things that we haven't been educated to notice. Those are the famous blind spots people keep telling us about. Who you are, your cultural heritage, your gender, your sexuality, how much money you have in your bank account, all these things influence how you view the world. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be a part of conversations about people different from you, but it does mean that people different from you might see things very differently, and you need to appreciate that. 3, critical thinking, questioning everything, never accepting anything on authority, being skeptical, working through questions to find our own answers, and then backing that up with as much evidence and logic as possible. 4, one that I like to always raise is logical fallacies. These are the type of patterns of thought that invalidate an argument. And people fall into these traps a lot, especially in political conversations. And we need to learn how to recognize them. And so we need to teach that in schools. I'm talking about stuff like ad hominem, which is attacking the person rather than the argument. Or straw man, which is attacking a version of their argument that they never actually put forth. Or appealing to authority, moving the goalposts in an argument. And critical thinking helps you recognize all of these little fallacies and to deal with them efficiently. There's many more, but moving on to actual subjects, so the first category of things we should learn. Instead of thinking in terms of classical subjects, I think it's more helpful to think in terms of ideas. What are the great ideas that we need people to understand so they can be productive parts in that larger conversation we need to have about our future? Maths. Brian already mentioned why math matters, but just to add some detail, what I think we should engage more in is things like statistics and probability theory. Statistics allow us to engage with data about the real-life world and differentiate between genuine extrapolation from representative samples and just broad generalizations. And probability theory, it enables us to analyze random events and predict the likelihood of outcomes, which, as you can imagine, is highly useful when making big life decisions, or any decision really. Science, I think the most important concept here isn't really a scientific concept per se, but the method of science, the scientific method itself, which we could say is one of those mental models from our first category of mental toolkit upgrades. The scientific method and induction and falsifiability, just the idea of formulating a hypothesis, running an experiment and observing the results, while also allowing for the potential that every theory can be disproved by another observation. All these things together are by far our best method for gathering knowledge about the world. So we need to understand how they work and what it is that makes them such useful tools. As far as an actual scientific idea, if I had to pick one that is valuable, that everyone should understand, it's evolution. Because I think evolution is the greatest scientific idea anyone has ever had. And I'm not just talking about how we came from monkeys and so we can make fun of religious people because, well, we come from monkeys and you won't admit it. It's more about how nature moves towards filling niches and how fitness for environment is what ultimately determines the survival or success of anything, from a cell to a plant to a human to an idea. Now, in terms of the classical subjects, people have mentioned history, but I want to talk about humanities as a whole. Everyone needs a firm grasp of the great ideas that informed the development of our human civilization. In the West, we have these three great trends. Antiquity, right? The ancient world, and the ideas and the stories and the culture that came from places like Athens and Macedonia and Rome. Then we have Christianity, understanding the philosophy of Christianity and the influence of the Catholic Church, and later Protestantism, of course, in making us who we are today. And then we have modernity, beginning with the Renaissance, taking us through the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. These are broad historic trends which gave us humanism and democracy and science, and this constant pursuit of progress which makes much of what the modern world is today. All these ideas, ancient individualism, Christian compassion, Enlightenment, progress in humanism, they tell us a lot about who we are today. But we also need to be familiar with Islam and its history, the rise of Muhammad and the early caliphs, the golden age of Islam, the fall of Baghdad and what that did to the world, the Ottoman Empire, the total debacle in the Middle East that began with the West's broken promises after World War I. All these things matter. As well as the Far East, we need to have a basic familiarity with the great ideas of the East: Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. If you understand Confucianism, you will understand much of what happened in places like China and Korea and Vietnam in the 20th century. It all fits in with what the big ideas of their culture are. See, I'm not even talking so much about history as much as about culture more broadly. All these ideas, they connect into bigger pictures of culture, and in turn, little bits of culture tell us more about ourselves and the world we live in. Culture is something that some people see as useless, just for the privileged few. But my point is, culture shouldn't be privileged. It should be for everyone, because it enriches our minds so deeply. It gives us such great moments of wonder and excitement and discovery and the most amazing connections. We should all know the difference between medieval and Byzantine art and the Renaissance, and not just because you can literally see how the art reflected the religious ideal of God's perfect immobility in medieval art, and then it gave way to this more lively and dynamic and human complexity of the Renaissance, but because these things are in of themselves breathtakingly beautiful, and knowing them makes you happier, knowing them makes you better. And you should know about Classicism and Romanticism, and how the former tries to reach transcendent ideals of elegance and grace and beauty, and the latter is all about personal self-expression, no matter how turbulent and violent it can be, no matter how ugly. And you should learn about jazz and rock and roll and pop art and hip-hop, because all these things shape our world and how we live in it, but also because they're just fucking awesome. In short, we need to engage with great ideas, with great art, with great stories, because these are the things that make us who we are. And without understanding why we are who we are, how can we ever hope to understand who we ever should be? Ladies, gentlemen, thank you for listening to today's episode of The Great Everything, and I hope you enjoyed it. Now, if you want to be a part of the conversation, there's a few different ways you can do that. If you're listening on Anchor, you can call in and we can have conversations. You can ask questions, and I'll be happy to include your call and your questions on the next episode, and we can discuss live. Or you can join the Facebook group, The Great Everything. It's a link to The Great Everything on Facebook. And it's just a group of a few friends, and we have discussions about, well, literally everything, as long as we do so respectfully and in a way that is interesting and stimulates conversation. That's what we're all about, interesting conversations. So if you want to be a part of those conversations, please check out The Great Everything, the group on Facebook. If you like what I do here, please help out. And the best way you can do that is also free of charge to you, is by leaving a review on iTunes or wherever else it is you listen to The Great Everything. If you're listening on a platform where you can leave a review, please do that. It is very, very helpful, and I'd be extremely grateful. Also, consider adding me on social media. There's the usual places, Twitter, Instagram, etc., but you can find all these handles grouped together on the blog, thegreateverything.com, where you'll also find interesting articles by myself and my friend Mark, with whom I started the blog. I hope you enjoyed everything and you continue to do so in the future. I am sure I will as well. Arrivederci.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.